Of course, for any of you who are watching online or missing this, all of these are available. If you go to our website and follow your nose, you'll see some bits and pieces of this. I don't have anything else to do except to let James get started, but maybe we offer a bit of a prayer to get us started. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. We thank you, dear God, that you have created space in our lives so that we can find you in unexpected places. In times when we are lost or excluded or rejected, you have been present. And not only have you been present in spirit, but you yourself know what it feels like to be lost and excluded and rejected. You have taken on these things because you know us to be all too human, and you have given us a way to live another kind of human life in you, the life that we were prepared to live, and the life that we will live by your grace and your example. Bless all those who are marginalized in this world. Bless all those who are scapegoated. Bless all those who have suffered in some way or another exclusion. And help us to know and see the new humanity you call us to be through your own love and grace and Son Jesus. Amen. Amen.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. I had the pleasure of talking with some of you on Thursday, and I began talking about the reading of myth, which René Girard, my guru, allowed. And I told you the difference between the Cain and Abel story and the Romulus and Remus story. Well, I'd like to move on from there today with a slightly different passage from Scripture and the myth associated with it to help us explore a little bit about what's going on with scapegoating and how we get beyond it. My guess is that you will all have heard of the Oedipus myth. Yep, it may have been drilled into you by Freudian psychologists. But you probably know the story. Oedipus is born. He's defective at birth, or so it's thought. He has a swollen foot, which is what Oedipus means. It just means a swollen foot. So, given that they think he's not going to survive, not make it to adulthood, he is exposed and left to die. But he's taken up by some kindly person and given a home and brought up and comes up to be a strapping, young, swollen-footed person. At a later stage, he travels from this place where he's been brought up by this kind stranger, and he's traveling to the city of Thebes. The city of Thebes is having some sort of great trouble, but at some crossroads on the way, he gets into a sort of a traffic row with an old man and kills him. It's kind of a road rage incident. But then he makes his way to Thebes, which, as I say, is having a plague or a pestilence or some sort of problem. So he joins in and tries to find out what's going on and discovers that comparatively recently their king was killed by some sort of stranger, and that the whole of the city is in some kind of upheaval. A sphinx is called to see if they can sort out whether the reasons for it. It'll all be okay if the sphinx riddle is answered. Oedipus answers the riddle and manages to become a top dog in the city, meaning the most eligible bachelor in the city, although he's an outsider, or a half outsider at least, and has a visible limp. Nevertheless, the the leading unmarried lady, who is at this stage the queen, as it were, of the city, because she has lost her husband. She takes a shine to him, and so he ends up bedding the first lady, and so becoming the first gentleman of the city. And problems continue, and there are great upheavals and gossips and all sorts of bitchery going on, as you'd expect in any city of this sort. And people start wondering, why is all this problem going on? And so there are squabbles and fights between the priests and the sages and the shamans, and basically what in our world would be the Murdoch press in one way or another. They're all engaged in soothsaying in one sort or another. And there's some sort of tussle that's still going on. And one version is that all this is kind of haphazard and someone must do something about it and there's nothing really that can be done. But the other version, which kind of begins to get to coalesce around something true, this is a particular sort of alternative fact. It suggests that, that old man that you killed, that was actually your father. You killed your father, and although you didn't realize it, the woman you are now sleeping with is in fact your mother. Da, 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 da. So you are guilty of these terrible sins or crimes, and that is why everything is going wrong. So we'll throw you out and everything will be fine. So there's a tussle, and this tussle is particularly beautifully brought out in the ancient Greek tragedies, which are themselves attempting to work through a more primitive version of the myth and introduce some sense of what's really going on in the myth, whereas they have a struggle between Tiresias, who's the priest shaman figure, and Oedipus, in which they each trying to out-talk each other as to who's right or wrong. And eventually, it's not that it's clear whether the alternative facts are true or not, it's just that no one can win the argument. It becomes indecidable. And Oedipus eventually accepts that this is true, that he did do these things, he did kill his father, and he did sleep with his mother, and agrees to be driven out. Okay? And so that's the end of that lovely, lovely little story. Now, because we're used to living in a world like that, we tend to assume that it must be true that Oedipus did kill his father and sleep with his mother. That's the story that we're all brought up with. That's what Freud tried to teach us we all really wanted to do. Doesn't seem very plausible to me, but there we are. That's the basis of the myth. But in fact, there is an alternative account of essentially the same myth in the book of Genesis. And it's the story known as the story of? Any ideas? Oh no. No, it's the Joseph story. With congratulations to all Josephs present. It was your feast day yesterday. I know that there's at least one here. Just think about the Joseph story. What happens in the first place? The first place is you have rivalry among brothers, which leads even to rivalry between father and mother and brothers. In other words, do you remember that Joseph has dreams? And his brothers say, what sort of dreamer are you? And eventually, even his mum and dad join. They become the equivalent of rivalrous brothers. There's no safe distance between them. They just enter into rivalry. Well, eventually, Joseph's brothers get rid of him. They manage to throw him out. Well, one of the brothers more kindly disguises the throwing out by using some goat's blood to sprinkle on the coat of many colors so that it looks as though some beast has done it, and in fact sells them to some Midianites who are trading, so they take him off to Egypt. And he's sold in a market in Egypt, if you remember. And what then happens? He's bought by, well, no, not by Pharaoh yet. He's bought by Potiphar. Yep, you remember Potiphar? It's a great name. And Potiphar turns out to be a good boss. Potiphar is clearly a good man. He trusts Joseph completely. He puts him in charge of his entire household. There's no rivalry between them at all. But Mrs. Potiphar is a bit annoyed with the lack of attention she's getting from hubby and decides to make to reach out to Toy Boy, to resident Toy Boy, to see whether she can have some fun while hubby's away. And Joseph refuses to play Toy Boy and says, "No, far be it from me. Potiphar treats me like a father. He has put me over everything. So how could I possibly take his wife?" It's the clearest refusal of the Oedipus conflict in the scripture. He's saying, because he is my father, therefore I can't. It's not because he's my father, therefore I want to. It's because he's my father, therefore I can't. Mrs. Potiphar, not happy with this completely novel psychological teaching, decides to make her go for him anyhow, and he escapes. But then she decides to blame him for having tried it on with her, because she's a little bit ashamed of what she's done. So he gets accused falsely of attempted incest and is thrown in prison, where, if you remember, he meets the Pharaoh's butler and the Pharaoh's baker, I think. Is that right? Anyhow, a couple of high-ranking, comestible employees of the Pharaoh who have mysterious dreams, which they don't really understand, and they're a bit troubled, and they stand there squabbling about their dreams, and Joseph comes along and says, "Why are you standing there looking so sad with your eyes cast down?" Which should be a beautiful phrase that is familiar to us, because it's exactly what Jesus says to the two disciples walking on the road to Emmaus. He actually quotes the book of Genesis at that point. He says, "Why are you standing there with your faces downcast?" It's the same Greek word. It just says to know how savvy St. Luke is in bringing bits of the Hebrew scripture to bear on the New Testament. But anyhow, so the people, the Pharaoh's butler and baker say to him, "Well, we've had these dreams and we can't interpret them." And Joseph says, "Well, all interpretations come from God." And then he proceeds to interpret from what it means. He says that one of you is going to have a rough time, the other is going to be restored. So that's that. So then that happens, the baker is hanged and the butler is restored, or vice versa, I can't remember. And after a bit, the one who survives, when things start going wrong in Egypt, remembers that there is this person who is able to interpret these things. In other words, to say something true about what's going on without fear or favor, because he told one that something bad was going to happen to him and the other that something good was happening to him. In other words, he's not a flatterer. And tells the Pharaoh that there's this guy, you ought to get him. So suddenly Pharaoh calls forth Joseph, who becomes Grand Vizier, Chamberlain, if you like, to the Pharaoh. And guess what? The Pharaoh is also a good dad in this story. Amazingly, the Pharaoh is perfectly happy with Joseph and says, "Splendid, you can be in charge of everything. I'm just going to retire in the background and be a kind of a sort of pharaonic face mask. And you get to run the whole show. Basically, anybody who says anything, I say, go to Joseph. Go to Joseph. Like the rector says here when it comes to musical matters, go to Joseph." So, the Pharaoh is a good dad. There's no rivalry between him and Joseph at all. Although Joseph is super competent and makes everything work, the Pharaoh doesn't think, "Oh, that competent git, I'm going to have to do something about that, or he's going to knock me over. He's going to have a palace coup." None of that. The Pharaoh is completely relaxed about having this ultra-competent prime minister who basically runs everything for him. Okay, at this stage, there are various bouts of splendid harvest and famine, and Joseph has prepared all for this and got all the grain things full, and eventually his family of origin in the Holy Land decide that they've run out of everything, and so they decide to come down to Egypt to see if they can get some grain, because they've heard that this grand vizier person is a bit of an economic miracle worker, and so they decide to come and take advantage and buy some grain. So they come down, and of course the Egyptian vizier would wear a mask, so they wouldn't actually see his face. You know, there's nice Egyptian masks, like in the Tutankhamun thing. They wouldn't see his face, they wouldn't know it, but he could recognize them all right. So he knows these are the bastards who tried to get rid of me. So what does he do? He treats them with immense courtesy and kindliness and everything like that, and he's kind of testing them to see if they remember how their behavior is, what's going on, and he asks them, but is this all of you? Aren't there enough? And eventually they say, well, there's one more of us. He said, well, next time you come, I want you to bring that one, because you must all come. And so they say, well, actually, you know, that one, I'm not sure that our father will let him leave because, you know, actually we had another brother earlier on and we kind of lost him, you know. So I'm quite sure that Daddy wouldn't like to let him go in case he loses him. So Joseph said, well, I'm terribly sorry, but there's no grain unless you bring him. So the next time they come back, and this time they bring Joseph, and of course he treats again, and the whole show is done very splendidly. And says, okay, now you can all go back. But then he hides a cup in Benjamin's sack, so as to give the impression that Benjamin has stolen something. Do you remember this story? So again, he's setting him up. Joseph, is treating his own brother as a potential scapegoat. He's bait at this stage. But it's interesting, what is he bait for? So off they go again, but Joseph sends is it not the IRS? They're your financial people. What are your immigration people now called? Homeland Security. He sends Homeland Security after them. And they stop him. They stop them and say, one of you stole the Pharaoh's cup. And they say, oh, no, none of us would ever do that. And so they quickly search around in all the luggage, and guess what? They managed to find a cup, which has mysteriously been placed there. You know, of course, police never do that. Police never stop people and never find packages of cocaine in their pocket, at least in white neighborhoods. You know how these things work. So Joseph and these people are brought back, and now Joseph says, well, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm afraid I can't allow you to go back. I mean, this guy has committed a crime. He's going to have to stay here. So he's pushing to see the reaction. And he says, I'm terribly sorry, there's just no way. I mean, I'm going to keep him. And at this stage, the second eldest brother, the eldest brother is called Reuben, but the second eldest brother is called Judah, and he was the one who'd somehow intervened a little at the time of the potential killing of Joseph, and had him sent to slavery rather than killed. He stands up and he makes actually one of the loveliest speeches in Holy Scripture, where he says, you know, we did this before. We let our brother be killed before. We were driven by jealousy. This is what happened. We let our brother be killed, and we're not going to do it again. So I would like to ask you to accept me instead of Benjamin, to be the prisoner and to face whatever wrath you need, because if we let Benjamin be killed, it will kill the old man. I mean, he won't miss me, but if Benjamin dies, Benjamin is the apple of his eye. If Benjamin dies, who was the second son of the wife that he really loved, who she died giving birth to Benjamin, it will kill him. So I do not want to kill my father. I will give myself instead for my brother. At which point, luckily, Joseph cannot control the tears. They come leaking out below the fancy mask. And at this stage, he tosses aside his mask. Ta-da! It's me! And so there's a general sort of kiss and hug all around, and everything gets splendid. So at this stage, he says to them, "Okay, now go and bring back the old man." So he goes. They go back and they bring back the old man. And at this stage, there's a huge party in the house. They make so much noise that Pharaoh's household is kept awake. So they say, "What the hell is going on? Why so much?" His brothers have come back. His family is here. At which point, if Pharaoh had been a jealous, rivalistic, bad dad, he would have said, "Oh no, he's got another family. What am I going to do?" But mysteriously he doesn't. He said, "Wow, that's wonderful. I mean, bring them here and let me give them a patch of land so they can cultivate their sheep." In other words, he's a genuinely good dad. There's not an inch of rivalry in this good dad figure. At which stage, and this is where you can really tell that the author of the Hebrew Scriptures knew what he was undoing. At this stage, it occurs to everybody that Joseph is not married, and that it's probably time that he got given a wife. So, what do? Well, the Pharaoh says, I want you to get married to the daughter of my high priest, Potiphar." What's the difference between Potiphar's wife and Potiphar's daughter? Potiphar's wife is in the presence of her mother. Potiphar's daughter is the right age range. It's a non-incestuous marriage. The name is as similar as you can have it, just as to remind you of this. And so that happens. Joseph now has a family. Meanwhile, the brothers are still absolutely full of fear because they think that Joseph has set all this up, and eventually, when Dad dies, he's going to kill them all. And Joseph has to calm them down, saying, no, even when Dad dies, I'm not going to kill you. I understand that God did this for my good and for the good of all of us. And so he undoes the mechanism. Now, can you see that literally every single element of the Oedipus story is undone in the Joseph story? The unlikely stranger from abroad is come in, brought into the midst, is raised on high. He already suffers certain accusations. The threat of incest is there, but is dismissed as simply not true. The notion of potentially false prophecies is there, but the distinction is made between someone who is prepared to say when bad things are going to happen and when good things are going to happen. The potential for rivalry amongst the ruling class is there, but it's shown that there is a perfectly non-rivalistic way of doing these things. The threat of killing Dad is there, but even one of the people who had run the risk of killing one of his own brothers is shown to refuse the killing of Dad. And even though Joseph has tempted them, they manage to resist the temptation. They've learned. They've learned what it was like to be run by rivalry and how that leads to falsity and false accusations. And they discovered instead that they mustn't be rivalrous, they must instead be self-giving. And eventually they become unfrightened, and you have a good dad and an appropriate wife. Now, can you see the difference between the myth, which most people take to be true, because people act simply as though it were a fact about humans, and the biblical story, which most people think is a nice story, but are unaware of how step by step it is the undoing of an ancient mythical story of persecution. Because what is the suggestion of the Joseph story when faced with the Oedipus story? The suggestion is this whole thing is based on accusatory lies. You've blamed everything on the half insider, half outsider, who's got a kind of a stereotypical problem. And in different myths and different cultures and different societies, it's either because people are too tall or too short, or too thin or too fat, or are missing a hand or are missing a leg, or have a swollen foot, or whatever it is. There's always a stereotypical problem that makes them half insiders, half outsiders. If they're completely outsider, they're not useful as scapegoats. Because if they're totally other, it doesn't really work. There's not enough similarity to us for us to actually be managing to make ourselves clean over against them. But if they're a half insider, half outsider, then it kind of works. Do any of you know what the 3 archetypal, stereotypical scapegoats were in medieval Europe? The 3 groups which, whenever there was an outbreak of fear, panic about something or other, would get it in the neck. Well, one group you surely know of, yeah? The Jews, okay? Most famously. Gypsies, number 2. And? What we would now call LGBT, if you like, non-heteronormative non-heteronormative people. Now, remember that most of these groups, most of the time, during the Middle Ages, lived peacefully alongside and in the midst of the rest of the population. They merely were the ones who were most at risk when, when fear broke out. And they were particularly at risk in towns that didn't have strong rulers. That's one of the things which happened. If the town had a strong ruler, the ruler tended to stop outbreaks of scapegoating of this sort. It's one of the reasons why, and this is a slightly bizarre fact, which you may or may not know, but a very distinguished American historian pointed it out, which is that more people, or let's say this, a certain number of people were killed, it's about 20,000, I think, worldwide, between 1492 and 1807 by the Spanish Inquisition, in all the territories ruled by the King of Spain, which from the time went from Manila all the way around to Manila again, via Mexico and everywhere else. So in that period, over that period of time, 20,000 people were killed by the Spanish Inquisition. Vastly more people were killed in the Black Forest, where the Gatto comes from, in Germany, between 1600 and 1630, as witches, than were killed by the Spanish Inquisition in 200 and something years. What's the difference? The Spanish Inquisition was a boring bureaucracy which had due process. It bored people to death, largely. Whereas witch hunting in the Black Forest was lynch justice. No process, no bureaucracy, speedy justice, speedy injustice, of course. And of course, one of the reasons we know this is because the Spanish Inquisition kept records, because they thought they were doing the right thing. Lynch mobs don't keep records. Indeed, everybody did it so that nobody can be accused of doing it. It's basically the rule of the lynch mob, isn't it? But the people who get it in the neck from lynch mobs are typically those who are half inside and half outside, have some feature that makes them able to be litten upon, so that they are conveniently other at the same time as same, so that something can be blamed upon them. And then, what are the stories? The stories appear time and time again. They are either against the father, they've killed the father or the fatherland, or they have slept with their mother. Do you know that Marie Antoinette was accused of incest immediately before being guillotined? Just to show how these things go on and on. Whenever there's a lynch build-up, you start getting very similar accusations coming up. So the mixture of lies, the attempt to require a dominant myth, the dominant myth, which is what we would now call alternative facts, is one which makes it righteous to get rid of the person involved, enables us not to be troubled by our violence because we are right, and means that we are now good over against the evil that has been done, and so we are at peace, having got rid of the evildoer. You see how that worked in the Oedipus story? And it's a lie. How do we know that it's a lie? Well, if you tell exactly the same story in very slightly different terms, we all know that it's a lie. For instance, there is a rather famous, not particularly good, and this is one of the pieces of literature that my guru René Girard uses, there's a famous but not particularly good poem written in the 14th century which talks about the arrival of a terrible plague. It's in fact what we now call the Black Death, but that's not how it's referred to there. And the poem is all about how there was this terrible thing called the plague, and no one knew what it was about, and people were being killed everywhere. But then God, in his mercy, shone down light from heaven and revealed that it was the Jews who had been poisoning the wells, and that they had done this. And so the people rose up and slaughtered all the Jews, and then mercifully God smiled upon everybody because they had been sorted out, and so the plague stopped. And so we listen to that and we say, huh? Why do we say, huh, when faced with that? Because we recognize a tale of persecution when we hear it. The Holocaust has taught us that. When we hear that story, read that poem, none of us would say, well, this whole thing is completely fake. We would say, no, we understand that there was a plague. We also understand that there was a violent massacre. But we know perfectly well that the violent massacre did not bring about the end of the plague. The end of the plague was brought about by other factors to do with rats and fleas or whatever the current explanation for the bacillus is. Killing the Jews made not one bit of difference except to the Jews who were killed. It was in no way part of the story. But what we have here is an authentic tale of persecution in which a group of people tried to make themselves good over against a group called bad. In other words, it's a strange mixture of truth and falsity. The truth is the description of the plague and the massacre. The falsity is the account given, the self-flattering account given. But we know that it's false because we have been taught to listen to the voice of the victim. And that is what is absolutely at the center of the Jewish and Christian thing, the gradual emergence from under the pile of stones of the voice of the one who was cast out, telling their version of the story. The Joseph story is the story of the recovered victim. Quite literally, the one who was thrown out, as it were killed, gets to be the one who organizes the forgiveness and is the one who tells the story. That is the key difference between the Jewish-Christian thing and all the mythologies which run our universe, which include many of our semi-Christianized mythologies which survive in our midst, unfortunately, on a daily basis. Shout out to the Murdoch Press once again. They're particularly good at this, but they're not alone. At least in my country, the United Kingdom, the Sun newspaper, which is one of the Murdoch stable, as a particularly good medieval lynch mob. The Daily Mail gives it a run for its money. But these are people who know how to build up hatred over against some other. In fact, the first owner of the Daily Mail, Lord Northcliffe, told his first editor in the 1920s, "Give them each day someone to hate." That is, he understood very clearly how the myth system works. The Christian voice understands that it is the one who we hate who has been falsely accused. They hate me without cause, is one of the lines of Isaiah put in Jesus' mouth on his way to the cross. Jesus is accused of being a blasphemous seditionist, blasphemous by the religious authorities, seditionist by the political authorities. The divine voice in Christianity always appears as the voice of the one who is unanimously hated and is in fact telling us the truth of who we are and what we're doing. That's what's absolutely at the center of the Christian faith. It's a very weird thing. We do not have, as an image or icon of God, a lawmaker or a priest in the ordinary sense of the word. Christianity has as the principal icon of God someone who was got rid of conveniently by lawmakers and priests. And therefore is the voice that speaks the truth about the very foundations of our culture as founded in royal and priestly idolatry. The sort of discourse of power which protects the togetherness by throwing out. It is better that one man should perish, one man should die, than that the nation should perish. That is both the royal and the priestly sociology. It's one very much alive in our world. And the Christian is exactly the reverse of that. The next line in St. John's Gospel, after Caiaphas says that, it says, and indeed, Caiaphas said that being high priest that day. He prophesied that Jesus was shortly about to die, was shortly intending to die, and that he would bring together all nations and all peoples. In other words, yes, that model is exactly right. And it's undone from within by Jesus occupying that space and telling the truth. You hate me without cause. So, how do we live this out now? It means, and this is the difficult thing for us, that Christianity is an awfully inconvenient religion because it's constantly shifting ground. It's shifting ground because we are constantly shifting ground, latching on to new bits of fake security by having new attempts at a flattering story to tell about ourselves, so that we end up good and someone else ends up bad. And the really weird thing is that the Holy Spirit is constantly at work undoing that, teaching us how, in a certain sense, to relax into our awfulness and stop judging each other for it. Because we are loved as we are. And it's as we discover our being loved as we are that we're able to stop building up fake goodness over against each other and trying to find new ways of holding on to security. Saying, you know, I trust I will be held in being in thy weakness. I trust that I will be brought to the place eventually where I can receive forgiveness from my victims, from the people that I didn't even notice I was mistreating. in my privilege and in my blindness, but also from those who I did sort of notice I was mistreating, but really wanted not to see. It's that space of half in, half out, which is like our most devastating moral space. Why do I remember this? I'll just end on a personal note. I remember, of course, I've been thinking for many years, into my 30s and 40s, about a Christian atonement and trying to work out how it worked, trying to understand this model which I've been explaining to you, which has God moving in to occupy the space of one who undergoes one of our lynch mobs to show us, yep, that's the kind of thing you do, and I don't hold it against you. Now let's see if we can play a better game, which is basically what Christianity is about. And I kept thinking about this, and then suddenly I remembered, why am I so obsessed with this story? And then I remembered, really quite clearly, aged 10 or 11, I was a kind of a dweeb at school. I knew I was gay, but of course no one could talk about things at that stage. And there were a whole lot of dweebs. I mean, I wasn't the only dweeb, but one of the things about us dweebs is that we know perfectly well that we're about to get it in the neck, and so the finger is always pointing. And I did something really terrible and really shameful, which I only understood like 20 years later, which is that I pretended to befriend one of the other dweebs, and then put him in the place of violence, so that the anger of the crowd could rain down upon him. The anger of the prefects, meaning the 12-year-olds, could rain down upon him, thinking that I was saving myself from being in that place. In other words, my moral formation happened roughly between the age of 10 and 12. And my moral formation was as a coward, a traitor, and a persecutor. And I have no idea how that person, I've looked up his surname on, kind of search engines and some of those school sites. Can't find him. Surname, yes, even in the area, the town which he lived. But Christianity is the religion by which that person, whose name was Andrew, comes alive as forgiveness and as the gift of, oh my God, so that's what I've been caught up in. And it needn't dominate my life forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Because of the time, I think we're only going to have a bit of time for some questions. And what I'm going to do, if that's okay with you, Father James, is I'm going to have us just go to the guild hall to continue the conversation. I know that some of you might want to run by that, but I just want to give you a little bit of time for some questions. The reason why we have to be a little bit short right now is we have a funeral at 1 o'clock. So let's just have a couple of questions, and then we'll have you guys move. Any questions? Go ahead, Mike. Wait for the mic so that those at home, and those at home following, this is the time to speak or forever hold your peace.
This is so, you sort of ended on a note of absolution for sin, I guess. And I'm wondering where you feel that absolution must come from. Would that absolution come from Andrew, or from God, or from both?
From both. Of course, I can't ask. I would, if he were alive and I could find him, which he may or may not be, I would, of course, have to say, as I tried to, I did this to you, can you forgive me? But the key thing is that the victim is risen with healing in her wings, to quote Malachi. So I think, oh my God, I did to him what we did to Jesus. And the whole point of Christianity is Jesus rose to say, yes, I know you do that. I don't hold this against you. Now learn to be my ambassadors. Be an ambassador for dweebs instead of a persecutor of dweebs.
Mark.
There's some parts of the gospel that seem a little harder than the unrelenting absolution. It's like the one we had today, where if the fig still doesn't give fruit in the 4th year, it gets cut down. So, is there a sense that that there's a limit? That there are times when it's too late to get absolution, or it's
I don't think that's up to us to decide anyhow. With the case of today's gospel, a couple of things. Those numbers are always deliberate. Okay, if you have a fig tree planted in a garden, remember the thing about a fig tree is that it absorbs a lot of sunlight, which means that nothing can grow under it. So it does occupy valuable space in a vineyard. That's what's going on there. Now, if you plant something for 3 years, you can't expect any fruit from it, according to Deuteronomy. There are quite serious rules in Deuteronomy about gathering fruit. For the first 3 years, no fruit. In the 4th year, first fruits to be paid to the temple. Only in the 5th year do you start to get profitable fruit, fruit for your own use and for selling. So, all Jesus' listeners will have known that. So the question is, what's the game that's going on here? Remember that this was the 2nd year in our measuring, but the 3rd year in their measuring of Jesus' ministry. They measured time, whereas supposing that you were in December of 2019, and then did something in 2020, and then finished it in January 2021, that would have been 3 years, because it was taken to be any part of the year counted as the whole. So Jesus says it's 3 years, and that his ministry has been going on, in our sense, 2 years by that time, but in their sense, 3 years. And he's saying, give it another year. This was at Passover time. The Galileans had had their sacrifices, their blood killed with their sacrifices. That meant Passover, because that was the time that lay people brought their sheep to be sacrificed so that they could then have a Passover lamb home. This was Passover time. This was the Passover before Jesus went up to his death the next year. Okay? So with that, what is he saying? He's saying, I'm going to plant manure around this, and then we'll see whether it will produce fruit. He's prophesying his death. And he's saying, but then if there is no fruit, then cut it down. He's prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem, which is part of his warning in the previous 2 verses as well, about the Tower of Siloam and the mingling of the blood in the sacrifice. So he's saying, there's a time here, but see whether we can change it around. I'm going to see whether we can produce fruit. In other words, God's purpose is the production of fruit so that we don't destroy ourselves.
Thank you so much.
Sorry
Would
about
you
that.
join me in thanking James? And I'm so sorry that it was so beautiful, so rich. And then, and take your time, folks. It's not like there's a burning building here, but we just want to make a shift, and we'll see you soon.